Talk of the bail bond insurance market becoming irrelevant in the face of cash bail reform efforts appear to have been premature as industry premiums continue to track in a mostly positive direction. Here to discuss a new report on the subject is David Blades, Associate Director, and Max Gilberg, Associate Analyst. And David, how might the COVID-19 pandemic impact bail bond insurers?
Even before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, there was an overcrowding problem in U.S. prisons and jails that was already long talked about, in the overall talk in criminal justice reform and bail reform. That's a characteristic, that overcrowding is a characteristic that makes these facilities ripe for some kind of a virus to come in and be spread quickly throughout the facility, and then unfortunately possibly be spread to anyone else that might come in contact with those prisoners and bring it back out to society at large. So even those individuals that might be held, in a jail overnight or for a short period of time, they could be exposed to these viruses, again, being amongst the larger population of prisoners. And that's something that criminal justice reform advocates looked at, especially when you're talking about some of these short-term detainees being held on minor misdemeanors. The thought was that there really needed to be something done on a quick basis to be able to lessen the number of detainees that are in there, especially nonviolent detainees, to make them, to clear them from any threat of the pandemic. And also, again, to help the general public at large, because, again, these large numbers could, as people go back and forth, endanger the overall public as well. And what that did was, again, there's already been a large push in a number of states for criminal and bail bond reform. And this just kind of accelerated the push and got the voices for those pushing for bail bond reform to speak up louder. And then, with the possibility of prisoners getting sick and potentially sickening or endangering the broader community, I think that's just brought more eyes onto it. And I think we'll see some states actually taking action. There actually have been some states that have released numerous pretrial detainees, again, hopefully those that are being held on minor or nonviolent crimes. And we'll see how that plays out in the overall specter of bail bond insurance and how much business there will continue to be for bail bond insurers as the years go on and as some of these criminal justice reform pushes and changes in legislation take hold.
Now, David, legislative reform measures across varying states have targeted cash bail. What are the opposing viewpoints to those proposals?
Okay, so on one hand, you have the people pushing for criminal justice reform, and their long-held belief is that the system is basically unfair and it's tilted towards those people who have greater financial resources as opposed to those who have lesser financial resources. The reality is, and there have been a number of studies, that there have been people held in bail on even small bail amounts, $500, $1,000, who are in jail because of relatively minor misdemeanors and definitely non-violent crimes. And those people are actually being held in jail at a higher percentage than people who might have committed more serious crimes but might have the financial resources to get themselves out. So from the criminal justice reform perspective, the fact that they look at the system as being unfair, especially to those people who don't have the financial resources to help themselves, they think that's the reason why they've been pushing for criminal justice reform. You have on the other side, whether it's politicians or definitely law enforcement, that look at the necessity for jails and prisons, because again, those committing crimes, especially those committing violent crimes, and again, violent crimes take on a number of different shapes and forms. Those people, again, those who are guilty or those who are at least have been accused and are being detained awaiting trial, to have broad changes in the rules that let too many pretrial detainees back on the streets, because again, what they're worried about is the chance that these criminals, these accused criminals, could potentially commit additional crimes or just not show up to court if they're let out onto the streets, or if they're released before their court date. So there's a push and pull in that respect in terms of the equity of the system and how fair it is with regards to the looking at the overall safety of the general public and the need to properly police and to properly use the jails and prisons to protect the overall broader community.
Now, Max, a prevailing view has been that these various legislative pushes could mean the end of cash bail and therefore bail bond insurance. But the report says that may not be the case, at least not just yet. Could you discuss that dynamic?
Yes, John. Well, there's been a bunch of legislative changes in a number of different states in the past few years, but direct written premium is actually 10.4% higher than it was 5 years ago. And this growth indicates that the overall bail environment right now continues to be healthy despite some of the substantial changes in the laws that are taking place. There was actually 2 more companies in 2019 compared to 2018 that wrote bail bond insurance, bringing the total to 27 companies. And actually in our report in Exhibit 2, we show the total face amount of all the bonds written over the past 10 years, and it's relatively flat, and there's actually a slight up curve in the past 10 years. So as of now, it remains relatively healthy despite all the market turmoil. But having said that, there is all these litigation going on and all these talks among politicians. So AM Best is monitoring the state-by-state legislation to see if anything could change that would make us believe that the line of business wouldn't be as stable long-term. But as of now, the premium shows that it remains to be healthy.
So, Max, are expense ratios a key metric in defining market performance?
Yes, well, expense ratios are an important metric for bail bond insurers, but it should be noted that historically, the average expense ratio of bail bond insurers are extraordinarily higher than any other line of business. And this is because about 90% of their premiums are allocated to an expense dealing with the bail bond agents. But to offset this high expense ratio, the bail bond agents are taking on a majority of the risk, and they're doing this by something called build-up funds. And build-up funds are a reserve account that bail bond agents use to allocate about 10% of the premium into that reserve fund. And the bail bond agents are also taking collateral from the defendant, such as real estate, cash, or anything along those lines. So, and those dynamics are extremely unique to the bail bond insurance market, and no other line of business kind of has something like that. So that's why the overall risk profile and loss ratio of the bail bond industry remains low.
So bail reform went into effect in New York at the start of the year, but the big picture is still changing. David, what do you expect will happen to this line of business in the long run?
So, John, what happens in the long run is really going to be dependent on the fight between those that we talked about earlier who are pushing criminal justice reform and those on the law enforcement side who are holding fast to the system the way it is now and who are willing to make some changes but are really leery of allowing too many pretrial detainees to be released back into society again. You mentioned New York, and that's an interesting case. In 2019, there was sweeping bail reform that was signed into law early in the year. And by the end of the year, the statistics started to show that there had been a spike in crime in New York City in particular, but throughout the state. And that put pressure on the governor, who had been, a very loud and vocal proponent of the bail reform, to reconsider some of the measures that were part of those sweeping reforms. As it turned out, in April of 2020, when the governor's budget was passed for the year, there was a rollback of a number of the features of the bail reform from 2019. So you can see in just that year, in a huge state where criminal justice reform was a major talking point, reform was passed, and then the impact of that reform that obviously wasn't intended led to those reforms being rolled back. So I think what we're going to see going forward, and what AM Best is going to continue to look at, is on a state-by-state basis how the argument plays out, what states or which states pass sweeping or meaningful bail reform, and to the extent that which it impacts the 20 to 30 companies that write bail bond insurance. That's what we're looking at. Those companies that write this small but interesting and dynamic sector of the market, and how well they do in writing that business. But if so much of that business goes away because of the criminal justice reform and changes in the legislation, then that's going to be something that AM Best will stay on top of analyze and continue reporting. And we'll see that could mean a very meaningful change in the market over time, but that's something we'll continue to look at.
Thanks, David. Max?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You can find the full report online at ambest.com. For AM Best TV, I'm John Weber.